Several weeks ago, as I was finishing up the sermon series on But God, one of those included part of the story of Moses when he was crossing the Red Sea and they were in peril. It says, but God, saved them from that. And the Lord just impressed me that the life of Moses, and if you just take the highlights of Moses' life, pretty important, pretty significant in the story of faith, in the biblical story. And so between now and the middle of August, I want to preach some of those stories of Moses and bring practical application to them. This morning I want to talk about the miracle of his birth and kind of the significance of what that means. All of us, psychologists have told us, and people that are much smarter than I am have told us that one of the things that we're all born with, one of the pieces of our psychology that we're all born with, is that we want to have significance. We want to make a difference. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but I'm just telling you that every one of us are born with this natural yearning in our life to be significant and to make a difference. And we all have experienced over time that things that are significant, things that happen that are of great significance, generally don't come very easily. Sometimes there is a significant price to pay for the accomplishment of significance, and sometimes it comes a little bit easier. But most of us know that the things that happen in our lives that are of great significance, they've taken lots of time and effort. And Moses' life is that very way. He was a significant player in the history and the story of the church. The entire book of Exodus is given over essentially to his life. You think about that. The entire book of Exodus is given over to his life and how he led the people from captivity in Egypt to the precipice of the promised land. Well, Moses didn't know Jeremiah. Moses didn't know Jeremiah existed, but there's a verse in Jeremiah that we've all quoted, and we may have it on a picture framed in our house, and it's found in the 29th chapter of Jeremiah, and many of you are reciting it in your mind even as I speak about it. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, the plan for a hope and a future, plans that you will prosper and not be harmed." Right? You know that you're familiar with that verse. You might not have known it was Jeremiah 29, but you're at least familiar with that verse. You knew it was in the Bible somewhere, and you've quoted it, and you've heard preachers talk about it, about how the Lord has a plan for us. He had a plan for Moses, and Moses didn't know what that was. And Moses never, probably prayed it in the way Jeremiah wrote it, because he didn't even know Jeremiah. But the very fact of the story of his birth leads us to an understanding that God had something up for this guy. Now, you may know the story of his birth, but I just want to remind you of a few of the details this morning, just so you can grab hold of the miracle nature of just the birth in the first few years of his life, and you'll begin to see the significance of all of that relationship to the entire story, and maybe help you understand that as God unfolds his plan in your life, that there's a miracle in that story as well. And so the story begins in Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. And I want to read the first chapter of Exodus. Kind of tells of the oppression of the Israelites, that they're off in Egypt. And then chapter 2 begins this way. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now why did she hide him? What happens in chapter 1? In chapter 1, the Egyptian Pharaoh says, wait a minute, these Israelites are becoming too strong, they're becoming too prominent, they're beginning to make a difference. So what do we need to do? We need to kill every newborn male child. Right? So this woman sees that he is a fine child. Now I don't know what that means, other than the fact that every mother thinks that their babies are fine, right? I mean, there's not a mother that looks at a child born that says, man, that's not the most beautiful baby ever. Now, not everybody is saying that. Some people are going to visit that baby, and when they're getting home out of the hearing of the mother, they're saying, that's the ugliest baby I've ever seen in my life. Right? You know that's true. You've done that. You've gone to see this precious brand new baby boy born, and mother and daddy are sitting, isn't it gorgeous? Isn't this a beautiful, perfect child? And you're getting home and you're eating dinner and you're saying, that child had the most warped head I've ever seen in my life. You've done that, right? We've all kind of done that. But Moses' mother knew that there was something special about this child. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Her sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So get the picture. Here's this baby in this basket in the water, sister standing up watching. Then the Pharaoh's daughter, now Pharaoh is the enemy here. Then the Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Now, what should have been their first move after that? Kill it. Right. There's lots of miracle in the story. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Okay, so there's the assumption already that we're not going to kill this child. Even though it's been ordered that all the male children be killed, babies, we're not going to kill this one. Yes, go, she answered. And the girl went to get the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now, if you really want to be honest about it, there's about 6 or 8 miracles just in those 10 verses that we read. The miracle that Moses' mom would have the insight and the foresight to protect her baby, because somehow she knew. There had to have been a lot of fine Hebrew boys born about the same time, but as God orchestrated this story, the miracle is that Moses' mom said, there's something about this child. There's something significant about this child. There's something that can be played out with this child. So we're going to hide it. When I can't hide it any longer, I'm going to put it in this basket. And then, believe it or not, it was right where Pharaoh's daughter was going and was going to go to bathe. And then the daughter doesn't, miracle number 3 or whatever is that Moses is kept alive. Is given back to his mother. How God orchestrated all that. Given back to his mother so that she could nurse him to health. And then Moses grew up a little bit more, and miracle number 4 or 5 or whatever is that Moses now becomes a part of the family of the ruling country here. You see all of that happen in the miracle of that? It was a miracle beginning. In order to have Moses in the place so that he could do what he had to do, there had to be a miracle. There had to be an understanding that significant things don't just happen very easily. And oftentimes, if we take a look at what God has for us, for each of us, then we will see that God's hand has been in our life. We just might call that coincidence. We might just call that, oh, that's just the way things played out. No, you need to understand this morning that God has had His hand on your life for a long time and has guided you to the place where you are now, and He may have something significantly special for you left in your life. And it may or may not come easily. It might involve hiding in the closet. It might involve something like hanging out in a basket in some water to be found by a significant person who will take you to the new place. Now, the entirety of Moses' life was something like the beginning. That's what's interesting about his story. And over these next several weeks, we're going to pick apart these stories and see how they apply to us. But I just want to say to you that, when you're doing something significant for God, it's not just a piece of cake. It's just not the easiest path forward. I mean, if you just take the highlights of Moses' life, you'll understand that Moses had to, even beyond his calling, and next week we're going to look at his calling, when he wanted to refuse to do what God would have him to do. He just wanted to refuse it for about 5 different reasons. Beyond that God would choose the most inexperienced and unqualified person to do the very thing that would write the story of the people of God. And he said, look, I can't talk, we'll look at all those next week. If you look beyond that, then you have this, Red Sea thing. You have the fight against the Amalekites where he had to have some help because he couldn't win the battle on his own. Then he had this whole 10 Commandments thing. It was no piece of cake either because and he had to do that twice. And while he's doing that, people are down there building a golden calf. Then he gets his people straightened out and he figures out how we're going to do the tabernacle. And then God says, look, you got to move that tabernacle all over the countryside. You just can't build it and keep it right where it is. That would be the great thing to do. That's what we would want to do. We want to just settle down in one spot and do one thing forever and let it be the right thing. But God said, no, you got to take that temple, that tabernacle, that moving thing, and you got to place it everywhere you go. Now you just go and read the part about the building and the construction of that tabernacle in the wilderness. And you think about what it took to construct it, to tear it down, to put it back together. This is not the 10 by 10 canopy tent that you're putting out in your backyard so you can have a cookout. This is a huge operation, and God says to Moses, look, you got to carry that thing everywhere I go. When you're following that fire and when you're following that cloud, this has got to go with me. And so Moses never did anything that didn't require a little bit of what? Of leaning on God. Of trusting in God. And when we want to do something significant, when we want to live out the plans that God has for us in our life, we need to understand that nothing significant, or most things significant that happens, don't come easily. And so Moses lived that out. He was destined for greatness. He had a miraculous beginning. And yet, there was difficulty along the way. And difficulty along the way doesn't mean that we're not following in the will of God. It means that we're being placed in order to trust and lean on Him in ways that we've never leaned on Him before. And if we don't, here's the principle. If we don't live our life such that on a regular basis we're having to lean into God, then we're only leaning into ourselves, and there's no faith involved in that. You become dependent upon yourself to live your life. And Moses shows us in the entirety of his life, in this miracle beginning, that we have to lean into God. We have to trust God in every step along the way. And there's a significant price to pay at times. Now I want to go back and share a thought or two that I shared this past Tuesday morning, and I didn't know it was going to be in the sermon, but it ended up in the sermon. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I preached about the Lord doing again, having great revival. And at the same time, if you didn't put all this together, but God put it together for me, that in that week before that I preached that sermon related to July the 4th, that my devotions ended up being, first of all, in 2 Chronicles. That's a great place to be before the 4th of July, right? Now, understand, I'm writing devotions, just so you're, for those of you who don't read them and aren't kind of keeping up exactly how I'm going, several weeks ago, as I was praying about writing those devotions, the Lord said, Alan, just pick one verse out of each book and write for the next 66 days. So that's what I've been doing, starting in Genesis. So right before the 4th of July, God orchestrated that. I didn't orchestrate it. The week before the 4th of July, I'm sitting in 2 Chronicles, and you get to 7:14, right? Is there one verse in the Bible that has more to do about revival in our country than 2 Chronicles 7:14? But then right after that, it leads into Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now that may not mean a thing to you. It didn't mean a whole lot to me when I was writing the devotions. But then the Lord just impressed upon my heart kind of this idea that significant things don't happen easily, and Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are illustrations of that. So I just want to take you back a couple of weeks and just pull out of these three books of the Bible. Ezra was given the task of leading the Israelites back to Jerusalem, right? You know the story of Ezra. If you read the book of Ezra, Ezra was given the task of leading the people back to Jerusalem. That's kind of what that book is about. And along the way, Israelites, being Israelites, became unfaithful. Now, I don't have time to describe to you all of their unfaithfulness, but in chapter 10, we get to chapter 10 of Ezra, and Ezra had enough of Israel's unfaithfulness. And so we read this in chapter 10. He's praying for his people. Ezra is praying for his people. Ezra chapter 10, verse 1. While Ezra was praying and confessing, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a large crowd of Israelites, men, women, and children, gathered around him. They too wept bitterly. Here's my question for you. Have you ever prayed for anything the way Ezra was praying for his people? Have you ever prayed for something significant in your life in the same way that Ezra was praying for his people, Nehemiah? Nehemiah was given the task of rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. Now that's significant. That had great spiritual significance, that wall did. It was a huge task. It was a spiritually significant task. And when Nehemiah heard his assignment, verse 4, chapter 1, Nehemiah, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then there is Esther. You know the story of Esther. Esther became queen. She was Queen Esther. Now there was a little thing that, you would think the queen had instant access to the king, but it wasn't just like that. If the queen went in to say something to the king without an invitation, she would what? She would be struck dead. So she was in relation. She had this conversation going on with Mordecai, and Mordecai had heard that there was a plot to kill, to wipe out, to genocide, an act of genocide to kill the entire Jewish population. And so Mordecai sends word to Esther, who was a Jew who had become the queen of the opponents, and said, look, you've got to go to the king and stop it. And she says, no, I don't. Because if I go in there to stop it, he's going to stop me. And Mordecai sends back a reply and says, hey, but maybe you were sent for such a time as this. Maybe you're where you are for such a time as this. And then Esther replies to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Look, some significant things just don't happen very easily. And here's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if we are all collectively willing to go through the difficulty, go through the things that aren't easy in order for God to use us in a significant way. Now, this last Tuesday, I used that in the context of praying for our church, the church, praying for revival in our country, and praying for the people that you know that are without Christ in their life. We call those people lost people. And we don't call them that often because it doesn't sound very nice. It sounds judgmental. It sounds like we are playing God and we're judging people. No, we're not. We're just being honest. You know people in your life. You live next to them. You work with them. You see them at the grocery store. Whatever. They may be in your family. And you know deep down in your heart you're not judging them. You're just stating facts. This person is not in a significant relationship with Jesus Christ. And are you willing? And am I willing? And are we willing together as the church? If we want God to do something significant in our life, are we willing, like Ezra, to pray and confess and weep and throw himself down before the house of God for days? If we really want something significant to happen, we might just have to be willing to lean into God in a way we've never leaned before. And we talk about, we talk about what we need in our country and revival. And I think most of the time it's just a passing thought. And the reality is that most of us, me included, we haven't spent significant time, not thinking, time, actually praying for our country and revival in this country. Oh, we've done it when we've asked to do it. We did it when we were asked to lead prayer somewhere. We did it, but I think the biblical example is something that we're not used to. And the life of Moses is not something we're used to. Because most of us would have just bailed out of Moses' story early on. Now, realistically, I speak in general terms, and you may say, well, you're not talking to me because I've spent long hours praying for a family member or this country. I understand that. But also understand that in general, as a whole, we'd probably stand together. And what Moses teaches us is that God has a miracle for us. It won't be easy. It won't be easy. But He has a miracle. And when we embrace that, that we can do and be something significant for God in our land. Let's bow our heads and pray. Father, may we recognize the miracle of our own story, of our own beginning, of who we really are. And Lord, may we in some way embrace that and live that, so that you may do with us the significant plan that you have for us. In Christ's name we pray.